Shabbat Shalom. So since we had a bat mitzvah 2 weeks ago and I was out of town last weekend, this is really the first opportunity I've had to address the community since the tragic attack on October 7th. We are living in terribly frightening times for our people. Anyone who's studied Jewish history knows that, of course, there have been many worse periods: the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Khmelnytsky massacres, the pogroms, and, of course, the Shoah. But we are not comforted by knowing that our people have been through worse horrors in the past. We are not comforted by the idea that many have tried to wipe us out before. We're traumatized by that knowledge. That anti-Semitism was less in the forefront for American Jews in the latter half of the 20th century and even maybe into a few years of the 21st century doesn't mean that it had disappeared, and of course we all knew that. We may have wanted to believe otherwise. But by 2017, when white supremacists marched openly in Charlottesville, we couldn't delude ourselves anymore. Exactly 5 years ago, 11 people were killed in their sacred space, their shul, on Shabbat. The massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue was not only devastating, but shook us to our core. And now we find ourselves not only brokenhearted, devastated, and terrified by the massacre in Israel, but fearful and lonely as Jews in the United States. It's hard not to feel fear when someone's expression of support for Palestinians might be coming from a place of hatred of Jews. Our ears are pricked up because of our history. The intergenerational trauma is deeply ingrained in many of us, whether or not we personally have family members who survived or perished in the Shoah. So one thing I hope we can all be aware of in this moment is that much of what we are feeling at this terribly frightening time for our people is a response to trauma. And this is something we all share regardless of disparate political leanings, regardless of our positions on military defense, proportionality, nonviolent protest, regardless of our relationship to Zionism, our experience with dialogue, whether we visited Israel, whether we've visited Palestinian towns in the West Bank, whether we grew up with blue J&F tzedakah boxes on our bookshelf in our living room or not. Our understanding of our history as a people and our understanding of what it means to be Jewish in this time and in this place mean that as we are navigating the unbelievable onslaught of information overload from news sources, the complete lack of nuance in memes and social media posts, the cruelty of crass oversimplifications, the silence of what is not said, as we beautiful souls who care about both our fellow Jews and of course do not limit our compassion only to other Jews, as we navigate all of that, we are doing so from a place of responding to trauma. And I say that not to negate the validity of any of our responses. Hahefech legamrei, the complete opposite. Our responses are raw, they are real, they are also very telling. They are speaking truth. The truth that we humans have created a very dire and disturbing reality for ourselves and our planet, and that Jews, and not only Jews, but those of us who get labeled as different, are especially vulnerable to the insidious spread of hatred against the other that has once again become normalized in our time. Like all of us, I've been reading probably too much news, opinion pieces. I've been trying not to read just the writing of those with whom I agree. The other day I stumbled on a guest essay in the New York Times by a Palestinian-American, Hala Alyan. Alyan is a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma, actually. I didn't know that when I read it. Then I looked her up. As I read her piece, what was surprising to me was how familiar it sounded. How much of what she said could have been written by a Jewish American, describing the experiences of both privilege and discrimination against her people, bias, misrepresentation, and inaccuracies in the media, and the dehumanization of her people by her enemies. She wrote, "The task of the Palestinian is to be palatable or to be condemned. The task of the Palestinian we've seen in the past 2 weeks is to audition for empathy and compassion. Those sentences could have been written word by word by a Jew. Just replace the word Jew where you see Palestinian, and it would have described exactly what it feels like for so many of us in the Jewish community at this time. I especially feel right now for the college students on campuses across the country, including those in our own state, where so much of the trauma is being played out in public scenes where garishness and exaggerated versions of the narratives take center stage. The tragedy of these scenes taking place in educational institutions, which are supposed to promote dialogue, intellectual curiosity, exploration of ideas, and an embrace of complexity, cannot be more obvious. Of course, this is also a place of immense vulnerability for undergraduate students who may not yet have a full grasp of the basic history of the region. Maybe they haven't yet had an opportunity to gain a clear comprehension of the history of their own people. Additionally, these particular students have been through high school during the pandemic. There are perhaps lacunae in their knowledge resulting from the interruption of their high school learning. One of the formative educational experiences in my life was a class I took in college and then I TA'd for with Professor Gordy Fellman at Brandeis. The class was called simply Sociology of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Gordy, as he insisted we call him, was known for being a lefty, but his classes were filled with students who ran the full range of the political spectrum. To his credit, he set out to make space for all the voices in the room, and most of the time he actually succeeded in doing so. Even before most people were talking about intergenerational trauma, Gordy taught about it, and he believed that the key to the conflict, and therefore the key to resolving the conflict, was in the narratives of these two peoples. He had us read not only historical analyses, but also poetry and prose. We read Mahmoud Darwish and we read Yehuda Amichai. Gordy argued that while history certainly mattered, it was the narrative that people constructed that really mattered, even if parts of that narrative were constructed out of flimsy, fabricated, or elaborated bits of truth. He believed the most important thing was for Israelis and Jews to hear and fully understand the narratives of Palestinians, and for Palestinians to hear and fully understand the narratives of Jews and Israelis. If that could happen, if understanding, not necessarily agreement, but understanding could be reached, if fear could be replaced with a shared sense of humanity, if each could see the other as a people with their own narrative and identity that made some sense, then he believed there would be the possibility for pragmatic negotiations. Gordy's optimism was contagious. I remember going into that class at the beginning of the semester ready to argue with him on everything. And I remember leaving the class ready to be his TA the next year. Unfortunately, that was the year the Second Intifada broke out. I had never seen a college professor cry in front of class before. He was heartbroken. Still, he tried to show us his optimism. He brought in a couple to speak to the class that year, an Israeli woman and a Palestinian man who had fallen in love and moved to the US so that they could live together in peace. To this day, I don't know if Gordy's hypothesis was right, because it's never really been tested. Perhaps the ifs themselves are just too iffy. Perhaps overcoming fear of a group of people once they've been viewed as a dangerous enemy is just too ambitious for our lizard-brained species. Perhaps seeking understanding is simply impossible as long as someone is living in fear. Gordy died about a year ago. His yahrzeit was just a couple weeks ago. He would have been absolutely devastated by what is going on now, especially by what is happening on college campuses, all the shouting and no one listening, demonstrations rather than dialogue with no deeper understanding taking root at all. It would have broken his heart. When I think about his emphasis on narrative, I'm reminded that back then, too, I couldn't help but notice some of the parallels in the poetry and prose. Both the Palestinian and Israeli authors wrote about their attachment to the land. Both sets of authors wrote about wanting a home, about wanting freedom, about longing for sovereignty. Often that sense of being abandoned by the rest of the world, of having to beg to be seen as human, that was also there. The attack on Israeli civilians in the resulting war has meant an increasing entrenchment in our own narratives. And by that, I don't just mean that there are two narratives, because of course there are so many more. How can we even consider making room for a vastly different narrative at a time when many of us can barely tolerate someone who disagrees with us even slightly? As the world outside insists that everyone, from celebrities to private companies to educational institutions, choose one side or the other, there also seems to be a temptation to divide into sides over all the details. As school districts across the country have received feedback about their public statements or lack thereof, many have been retracted or rewritten because they went too far in one direction or didn't go far enough. Everyone's shouting at each other. Many people have been deeply hurt, including a friend of mine whose husband is a rabbi. They live in Atlanta. Their children attend a public school there. And they felt completely abandoned by their community when the Atlantic School District sent out a statement framing the attack on Israel as a struggle for justice and equality. Many parents have been concerned, and I believe rightly so, that a school district's biased statement can directly impact the children, leading to hate speech and bullying. But in Evanston, Illinois, 2 members of the District 65 school board tried something different. Joey Halpern and Omar Salem, a Jew and a Palestinian, came together in unity with a message that was sent out to district staff, parents, and caregivers. Because it was written by the 2 of them together, and because it specifically focused on protecting the children from hate, it brought the community together. What a powerful counterpoint to all that we are seeing around us. While a war wages in Israel and Gaza, those of us in the diaspora need these reminders that the war is not here, and we don't need to be recruited into an approximation of it. As I've been writing about and talking about the events of the past few weeks, I have noticed myself working extra hard to avoid violent and inflammatory forms of communication. Truth is, it's not that hard, but I'm focused on it. I try to speak from my heart, and I try to speak to what I believe will hold our community together rather than tear it apart. And I'm amazed by the way our community has been engaging with each other and sharing concerns and honest feelings with me. What I've been seeing the past couple of weeks is exactly what I spoke about on Rosh Hashanah. Even as we figure out the kinds of details that can be divisive, should we have signs in front of our shul or not? Should we include Palestinians in our prayers or not? All of these questions, which hold so much power and are so incredibly important to our sense of moral clarity, identity, and knowing that we're all part of and not on the fringes of this beloved community, what I see in our shul is an understanding of what it takes to be together and to show up honestly for each other. And that takes courage. It might mean expressing a view that you're not sure will be shared by the person listening and trusting them with that. It might mean telling your rabbi you think she's wrong. It also means being willing to say, I am committed to being part of a community, knowing that there is certainly someone in the room with whom I vehemently disagree. I think we all have to ask ourselves, can I be okay with that? And we all know it's a matter of how far. We all have our line, but we also know that each of us is going to be a little bit uncomfortable some of the time, and that's what it means to be in community together. And we know that we'll never find a Jewish community in which we all agree on everything. There's a reason for the jokes about 2 Jews and 3 opinions and the man who's found on a deserted island with 2 synagogues on it, because one is a synagogue he won't set foot in. But there's also a reason that Jewish communities have persisted despite despite the understandable stance of, I just wish everyone would see it my way. I am right after all, and it would just be so much easier if everyone would just see that. I often come back to Yehuda Amichai's poem, The Place Where We Are Right, because it is so very true. We can't grow like a beautiful garden if everyone is plowing and trampling our spaces like a yard. We can't grow as a beautiful community if we don't make space for doubts to dig up the earth like a mole, like a plow. And we'll never hear the whisper at the place where the house, the Beit HaMikdash once stood, if all we do is shout at each other. Ultimately, when I think about all the trauma of our people and the deep existential fear that has been triggered for us lately, there is only one thing that comforts me, and that is our shul community. Because this community is really about showing up fully. I've had some very meaningful, but also really some not so easy conversations recently, and I know that there will be more of those. In my writing and in my speaking, as I try to hold all that there is to hold right now, it is impossible for me to speak in the voice that each of you would speak in, to say everything exactly as your ears would like to hear it. Nonetheless, I hope it is clear, as I have said repeatedly now, that my goal is for us to be in dialogue together, to learn from each other, and to ultimately grow together, so that we can live out our understanding of Torah and make this world a little bit better. That takes time. It's slow work. I can't remember how many times lately, in the middle of a conversation about what's going on, I have sighed, or at the end of the conversation, and said, unfortunately, you and I are probably not going to solve the crisis in Israel today. My optimism lies in these conversations nonetheless. In the spaces where we listen, in the spaces where we find common ground, and in the spaces where we stretch and grow, and perhaps allow our perspective to change even a little. Because ultimately, I believe, our strength and perseverance as a people has never involved being of a single mind. It has always been that we challenge each other, but also care about each other and show up for each other. We have been doing these things long since before October 7th, and we will keep doing them, even when it's hard, especially when it is hard. And right now it's pretty dang hard. I hope that being together on Shabbat during these weeks brings all of you some comfort, all of us. I hope the peace of Shabbat finds some space to inhabit in our hearts today, despite the horrors of the outside world. And for anyone experiencing the loneliness of being a Jew in Minnesota, the loneliness of being a progressive who still cares about her fellow Jews in Israel, or the loneliness of believing in peace and human rights when war is raging, I hope all the lonely Jews feel at home here. I hope everyone feels at home here. And I hope we're reminded today in this space of what it means to belong to a holy community. Shabbat Shalom.